to discuss Remembrance Day, British militarism and giant poppies. I'm joined by Navarra's own Dalia Gebrial and ex-soldier, author and friend of the show, Joe Glenton. Thank you both for joining me.
Pleasure.
How are you doing?
I'm okay, but, got a bit scared there that, Tisky might not happen this week, but we dragged Gary.
We dragged Gary back. Yeah, I've never met anyone so impassioned about watching fireworks on Guy Fawkes, but we've dragged him back after the technical glitch.
Free Gary.
Never more than 15 minutes away from the Rara studio, which is lucky for us. And now we are live. And also, we were attempting to automate Gary, so as the articles come up on it, he's so troublesome little lad. We like him, but, people make human errors, don't they? Whereas me, no. So I'm going to have my the images coming straight from my laptop, which will hopefully happen right now. We're going to start with Joe Glenton's article in the Independent. Headline: How do we know it's poppy season again? The foaming rage of war-hungry gammons. And I say that as a veteran. So I'm just going to read out the first 2 paragraphs. It is that time of year when a vocal and presumably rather unfulfilled section of our society begin to fantasize openly that they not only fought but actually died at the Somme. I had hoped, as a modern veteran and descendant of First World War soldiers, and given this is the centenary year, Britain's Twitter patriots might chill out for 2008 after we did so well at the football. Not so. It is testament to the lamentable state of public debate in this country that what should be a sombre and thoughtful annual commemoration, during which we reflect on the glorious truth of death in war, has become instead a carnival of dumb obedience where even the mildest critique is liable to be crushed under an avalanche of blood-drunk gammons. Harsh words. Joe, you're not a fan of Remembrance Day, or at least how we celebrate it.
I don't know if fan is the right word, but I fully recognise that there should be a Remembrance Day. And I'm old enough to remember a time when it was a much more, I sound really old now, much more dignified and sombre occasion when we actually thought about the impacts of conflict. And that, I would suggest, over the last 10 to 15 years has changed radically to a kind of carnival in which various actors and big interests play out this kind of fantasy war festival thing, which is deeply distasteful to me as a veteran. And it should be to, whether you're a veteran or not, it should be distasteful to you.
Does that make you rare as a veteran who is not wholeheartedly embracing this day, which I suppose is all about you in a way? So, I mean, most people will have seen veterans or current soldiers either outside their supermarket or at the tube station, at the train station. Do you think you are almost singular in your skepticism about Remembrance Day?
There's a couple of things there. I don't think it's about me. I don't think Remembrance is about veterans anymore. I don't think it's about remembering, which we can get into. It's about something much broader and bigger and much more profoundly connected to things like foreign policy. And I think someone, it's difficult, even as a veteran, such is the power of remembrance, the hijacked remembrance that we have. It's very difficult to publicly critique it, even as a veteran. Though veterans do have more of a platform to do it and should. Behind the scenes, veterans are very critical of the tone, of the involvement, for example, of arms companies in Remembrance in recent years, of the kind of celebratory tone of Remembrance. But it's hard to speak out about that because it's such a fraught time to raise criticism. And I think we see that when even mild criticism is raised by people not wanting to wear poppies and so on. There's loads of examples, isn't there? Yeah.
So, those examples was where I was going to go next.
Oh, really?
So, one, just for traditional, is people bowing at the cenotaph and the media deciding whether or not the leader of the opposition has done it with enough gusto, is a month or so of, really confected outrage about people who aren't who aren't remembering properly, let's say. So you had a bunch of those in your article. We're going to go through a few of them now so you can explain. First, we've got British Transport Police said no poppy stickers on their cars. What's that about? Why did they do that? Why did they show such disrespect?
How could they? How could they outrage? Why do they hate Britain? So there's actually it's kind of a tactic, I would suggest, of militarists of all stripes, liberal and conservative, where they kind of manufacture a certain amount of outrage around this time of year over small things in order to push the agenda for the militarized remembrance. And that really was about coppers were putting poppies of unknown provenance. They wanted to put them on their vehicles, as I understand it, and their bosses said, no, you can't do that because we don't know where they're from. They're not Royal British Legions. We don't know if the money you pay for them will go to the official charities which the British Transport Police endorse. So really it was kind of like just someone saying you can't deface work stuff as you want, but it was turned into this massive moral outrage.
So we got the Daily Express article with the poppies banned, of course, all in capital letters from police vehicles as stench of political correctness hits.
Exactly. It's also important to bear in mind that
stench, you can smell it from a mile off.
Vile. But coppers wear poppies, and the ones who are veterans, you will notice if you look closely, wear their military medals. There are other ways to express this, and obviously the police are permissive enough to allow them to do this in other ways. So why it would be an issue to stop people just banging on stickers? I mean, the army are major stakeholders in Remembrance, and they don't let you just start smashing poppies onto your Apache helicopter. It's just not the done thing. Though I think a couple of years ago they did make their own jet with poppies on it.
Yeah, we can get that up in a second.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I feel like the British Transport Police, it's all right. They're allowing poppies so long as they're official. But you know who did make my blood boil?
Go on.
Those poshos at the Cambridge Union.
Oh, God.
So Cambridge Student Union, we can get up this next controversy. Mayor slams Cambridge University students after they turned down call to promote Remembrance Day and to encourage people to buy poppies. What's going on there? Is this snowflake generation screwing over our working class troops as they sit comfortably in their Cambridge halls?
Disgusting. No, I don't think it is. As I understand it, again, when I looked into this, some Tory students put a fairly lame motion, which is quite vague, about how Remembrance should take place, and some other students put a counter motion which was more nuanced, and they won. And it seems to be what, I mean, students are supposed to be presumably thinking critically and exploring things and having arguments. I don't think it's particularly controversial, to be honest. But of course, because we're coming up to what many veterans call Christmas for fascists, it becomes this huge thing and runs and gets loads of the Daily Mail write a hit piece about it, and it becomes this this storm.
It was very smart for the Cambridge University Conservative Club. They got an invite to Good Morning Britain for doing that. So it's one of those really clearly constructed examples where a right-winger puts something forward they know won't pass. So Cambridge Union, I mean, the way I describe it is sort of Remembrance Day is very clearly remembering only British troops.
Yes.
Universities are places where people are from all over the world. There's going to be plenty of people of Iraqi descent, plenty of people from Afghan descent, plenty of people I suppose it's Remembrance Day remembers troops in India, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, descent of countries where British troops were sent to kill their ancestors. So I can see why the Cambridge Union would potentially want to come up with a slightly more nuanced proposal than encouraging everyone to buy those red poppies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, like, for me, it's, and this is, again, like a shift that I've seen over the past 10 years, and I think my theory would be that it kind of is a way of ameliorating, like, the fact that anti-war sentiment has actually grown quite a lot in this country. People are actually, and across the political spectrum, I don't think across the political spectrum, there's generally a feeling that, things like the Iraq War were kind of fought for profit, or they were fought by the elite, and that, we shouldn't be getting meddled, we shouldn't be meddling in these kinds of affairs, and that we shouldn't be we shouldn't be engaging in these kinds of wars. Like, war is quite unpopular at the moment. And so I think this heavy investment into, like, this it's ultimately like just a form of discipline, right? Like, literally, are you lowering your body, like, low enough? Are you embellishing your body, like, in this particular way? It's a form of, like, enforced, I think, as you said earlier, like, enforced obedience, right? It's a disciplinary mechanism that I think is in part a response to the growth in anti-war sentiment. But also, I just think that it's, I don't know, it's kind of, as well as being a kind of enforced discipline, it's also a kind of another symptom of this growing kind of sense of nationalism as as like a kind of test of loyalty. It's almost like that Norman Tebbit test, like writ large. You know, the poppy of like, you wear it, like, are you pledging allegiance to this particular kind of nationalism? Because of that anti-war sentiment, I think that really the poppy is just becoming a proxy.
So the Norman
for
Tebbit
something
test
else, right?
was, he said some's British if they support. Do we have a British cricket team? We have an English cricket team,
yeah,
don't
England in the cricket.
we? I don't like cricket.
No.
Yeah, like so because like obviously like a lot of cricket fans, like there were lots of like South Asian cricket fans, and it was like, are you going to support like, you know, England or, you know, whatever your country of origin is? So I think the poppy is kind of becoming a Tebbit test for something bigger or something else, or maybe the same thing, I don't know. But basically the point I'm trying to say is that it's a proxy for something else, and what it is, we can, you know, something that we can unpack here.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think if you look over the last, say, so like mid 2000s, just after I was in Afghanistan in 2006, I think, and that was the first tour. So in the year after that, I would suggest you can look back, and there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that a group of actors, including people in that Labour government of the day, Gordon Brown, General Dannett, who was the head of the army at the time, sections of the Murdoch press, the establishment, if you like, though it's much more complex than that, I wouldn't want to be unnuanced, recognised that public opposition to the wars, which you mentioned, was going to hinder British foreign policy in the future. And so they looked at ways to adjust that. And I think when they looked at ways to do that, they looked at the American model. And the Americans have they're much further down the road of what we're seeing here, the kind of thank you for your service crap, which is really, it's just like common parlance there. And they looked at that and thought, how can they transplant it to this country? And that's when you see the rise of particularly in very politicised charities like Help for Heroes. You see a new and re-energised British Legion really pushing this kind of agenda. And fundamentally, underneath it, it's about conflating opposition to the war with disrespect for the troops, and making it hard to not be for the troops, and saying that if you question the war, if you're critical, it's about reducing space to be critical about British foreign policy, key tenets of British foreign policy, which are aggressive and expeditionary. And I think when you look at that, and there's been a lot of good research into that, you start to see this picture emerge of an attempt to remilitarize society, which now, coming into the centenary year, is really at its peak.
Sorry, I'm trying to get my computer to connect to the TV. It's definitely struggling. So we're going to skip past a video of James McLean getting booed by some fairly disgraceful Middlesbrough fans hurling abuse at him. Oh no, I'm still not connected. Jesus, this is complicated. Too many things to think about. All right, while we sort out the technology here, because we can't, I was going to go to pictures of ridiculous uses of the poppy, but we'll do that later in the show. So what I am going to do is something very low tech, which is ask you about your book.
Oh.
Yeah. So I want to get your proper backstory, right?
Okay, yeah.
So
checkered past.
Your book, Soldier Box, I was reading it this weekend. Very interesting, very enjoyable. So I'm going to start from the beginning, though. You're from an anti-war family. Your mum was marching against the Iraq war in 2003, but it was precisely in that year you decided to join the army, thinking it was a moral thing to do. Tell me what was going on there.
Well, it was a mix of things, you see. I don't know if I was from an anti-war family, but certainly she was anti-war. She was anti that war.
Yeah.
And when people join, there's a spectrum, and there's the poor bloke, and then there's the ideological guy, and then people are generally along there, and that's their motivation for joining the military. Towards the broke end of that spectrum. But certainly in a country with an imperial and colonial past, where we think about the military in very particular ways, the ideological stuff is always there. And somewhere in there was my motivation for joining. I wanted to join in 2003, ended up, because the process was quite long, joined in 2004. Joined, went through training, went to Deep Cut, did my second load of training, was posted to Colchester to a unit called 13 Air Assault. And they had come back from Iraq. They'd been in the Iraq War in 2003, and they were desperate for another tour. And so over the year or so I was there was the build-up, like, are we going to go back to Iraq? Because units vie for tours. They vie with each other. It's a whole political battle within units.
And everyone wants to go.
Yeah, well, people do, people don't. But there's various motivations, and it's really interesting how they G you up. It's like, and it's like you make good money on tour. Because you don't.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Or like even more like if you're like I was relatively old when I joined. I joined at 22, so I was like the elder statesman. Like there was kids there who couldn't deploy when we deployed because they weren't 18 yet.
Oh my god!
But there's all kinds of like you'll people respect you more when you have a medal. You'll make loads of money on tour. Chicks will love it when you've been on tour. And literally these arguments, which obviously appeal to a young, dumb squaddy as I was, to like G you up in readiness for the tour. And in the end, it turned out we were going to go to Afghanistan.
So then you go. What happens when you get there?
So in the build up to that, we were given various I'm quite confused rationales for why we were going, like dealing with the opium crop.
How would that work? Just bombing
the
fields?
It was never clear. Yeah. As it turned out, a load of people went out and
we're going to harvest the poppies and use them to remember our dead. So that they can't be turned into heroin.
Yeah, and basically like they tried burning a load of poppy fields because that year was like a bumper crop. It was the biggest crop ever, and the guys burned loads of opium. But guys stood there with rifles, and we got the Afghans to burn it because we're like, we ain't touching that shit. Maybe they didn't trust us with opium. I don't know. But that was one of the rationales. Then it was like, like kind of peace support, like humanitarian operations and so on. But various reasons. And you can go back and look at the press at the time and see why we were so confused. And what we were being told by our commanders was that we were really confused. And so we went out there. We weren't doing any of those things. We got there to southern Afghanistan, which was, and you have to understand at that time, the Taliban had kind of gone. They had fled, and the focus had been on Iraq. And Afghanistan was very quiet. And then history will tell you what happened is they sent a load of paratroopers into Helmand. I was in Kandahar next door. We were doing the logistics stuff for them. And their presence created the insurgency, which played out until 2014 at the cost of 400, and I can't remember the figure, 57 or something, but more deaths than in Iraq. And so we became this, our presence there became this kind of lightning rod. And our presence there was rejected by the local population who didn't want to, who played both sides, understandably, because they've seen in Afghanistan, they understand that invaders come and go. And so what we actually did was create a humanitarian crisis, which is still playing out. And I got the last figures I heard, 12% of the people fleeing from the Middle East and Central Asia to Europe are Afghans. And some of that, I have no doubt, can be traced back to that intervention in 2006 in Helmand, for sure.
From your personal experience, though, so at what point did you realise you weren't in favour of the war, or that you weren't happy to do what you were doing? I mean, as I understand it, you were doing logistics in Kandahar, so that was sort of like arranging the delivery of ammo and bullets.
We were working on ammunition, and there was no like highlight reel moment where Billy got shot, my best buddy, and it all went terribly wrong. It was just a gradual realization that
we weren't there to liberate the Afghanistan people.
Yeah, like in slow motion, like Johnny, no.
And I sat at my laptop thinking, maybe we're not going to stop the heroin crop.
Yeah, exactly. That was literally, were you there? Right. So it was like, what was it? It's like a culmination of things. This is why we were told we were there. And then this is what was actually playing out. But I guess because we weren't on the front line and we weren't infantry. Like if you're in the infantry, you don't have any time to think about this shit. You're like sleep, patrol, fight, sleep. Whereas we were a step withdrawn, so we had more of an overview, and we'd get daily briefings about how badly everything was going and how much damage it was doing to local communities and how alienated people were becoming. And it just became, on a purely moral, not a political level, because it wasn't political. I was just like this kid. On a moral level, I started to think, actually, this is fucking bullshit. And I'm not really happy to be involved in it. But obviously, it's not, the army does not have like debating societies where you can like thrash out these things. So there was a general sense among my colleagues at the time that this was bullshit. But if you're a soldier, you're taught to, like, the politics don't concern you.
So you think there's a general sense that it was bullshit, but that never got spoken? Was that unspoken?
Some people spoke about it, but you crack on. The term is you crack on with your job. The politics are not your concern.
Were there any like ways in which that sort of disaffection or questioning reared its head at all? Like, if you can't talk about it, you know, are there any ways in which it kind of manifested?
Certainly for me, because I became, as it went on, very dejected about it. And it was my first tour. I wanted to like impress and get promoted, which I did from my efforts on that tour. But I found it very hard to just crack on. Like, I managed to do it, but I found it very hard because all this stuff was playing out in the background. Like, they were bombing civilian compounds. We ran out. This is a peacekeeping operation. We ran out of artillery ammunition, and I was on the ammunition. I was like, if we're here to help these people, how have we run out of high explosive artillery ammunition? So it's more like, it's almost like the devil's in the details, because we were seeing stuff, ammunition come in and out. And then we would be aware of how it was being used and stuff like that. It became clear that there was something that it wasn't as advertised, per se. And some people can just do that and not worry about it. But I developed what would be known as a conscientious objection to that, though I didn't have the language or the education to be able to express that. That is what I developed over a period of time as a culmination of this 7 months on tour.
So when you first joined the army, you sign up for 5 years, don't you? So you're sort of contracted to work for them for a certain period of time?
Yeah. So you do 3 years, and then you have to do 4 because it's a year's notice. That sometimes changes. So you do 4 years as a basic thing, or you can stay for like 22.
And what year are you in at this point?
I was like a couple of years in.
Yeah. So you can't just quit, right?
No, I didn't have the option.
So what do you do in that situation? You've been sent to Afghanistan. You decide you don't actually back this. You're not really comfortable there. You don't really believe in what you're doing. What do you do next?
Well, we finished our tour and we came back, and my plan...
How long's the tour?
Ours was 7 months. Normally a 6-month tour for us. Americans do like a year, but we do 6 months. So I came back and I planned to serve out my time and sign off. And it was a real weird thing because I came back and they were like, I got promoted like 3 years ahead of my promotion curve, because they were like, Glenton, you're a good lad. Because I loved it. I was like green. I was green as fuck. I loved the army in many ways. But I was like, right, I've been recognised and I kind of like this thing, but I don't think I can do it. So I planned to serve out my time and just leave. And I also knew that we were covered by something called Harmony Guidelines then, which the military later abandoned, which meant that you can't be redeployed within 18 months. And it's a mental health thing, but they're guidelines. And so I was posted to another regiment, and they said, we're going on tour. Do you want to go on tour? And I was like, no, I'm not going to go on tour, because Harmony Guidelines, they gave us an option, unusually in the military because of this. And then, so I was a couple more months of that regiment. They said, you are going on tour. At which point my hand was somewhat forced, and I'd started to manifest symptoms of post-traumatic stress from, we were attacked with mortars regularly, and some Americans got fucked up. But then they tried to make me to go, at which point I kind of had to try and pursue it. But again, I didn't have... Now I know that there's a board for conscientious objection in the army that you go in front of, and you'll almost inevitably be fucked off and told, no, you're not. Because I have another friend who got to that stage.
How does that board work? So you have to convince them that you genuinely are
yeah,
morally opposed to the war.
And all they do is move the goalposts. Like just a year after me, a Navy guy who's a medic got to the board. He got to the board, and they said they try and like catch you out, and they said, is it a religious objection? They were trying to make out, because one of the people on the board is a priest, like a military padre, a chaplain, and they basically argued that because he's not religious, he was an atheist, his objection had to be political, and fuck him. So he had to go, and so he ended up in jail the year after me. And so they try and move but I mean, also, I don't want to defend the people in my chain of command who wouldn't let me pursue it, but very often they themselves don't know, and they still view conscientious objection as, they would just view it as indiscipline, or they would view it as most of society does through the prism of World War I, conchies, cowards, the white feather, all this kind of crap. But they often don't know that there is a procedure, and that conscientious objection is a contractual and legal right in the British military. It's a right. You have a right to conscientiously object.
I mean, they're in a bind though, because if you I'm not defending it, but I'm just saying, like, this is where they're coming from, right?
Yeah.
If as soon as a soldier has a doubt about the war they're currently fighting, they can opt out, the British military would be fucked, wouldn't they?
Exactly. But they're also, I mean, because they're what they always say is the floodgates will open, which I don't think would happen, because it's very hard, even if it was allowed, it's very hard socially, because the military is such a tight-knit unit in a way that civilian life just isn't. It's very hard to do that, to go through that process. It's a very trying process. So I don't think there would be a kind of rush for the door I mean, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that there is. But also there's a question about if a guy doesn't want to go, why would you want to take him to a dangerous situation? Why would you want to put that guy who doesn't
believe in what they're doing,
believe in what you're doing, or has an objection strong enough to raise it? In my case, with a spotless record in the military, why would someone risk that? I mean, there are lots of factors which you would think would make people take that seriously.
But they were going to risk that with you, so they were going to send you back to Afghanistan, even though they had doubts about your commitment to the project.
Yeah, they did.
And that's the point at which you went AWOL.
It is, yeah, but it's also important to understand that I'd started to manifest what I now know is post-traumatic stress and various other things, moral injury, which is a whole other factor, which isn't really recognised in this country. The American military recognise it.
What is it? Moral injury?
Moral injury is like, so post-traumatic stress is when you're exposed to like a massive amounts of fear and adrenaline, and that sticks with you. Moral injury is when your code of morality is shattered by something, whether that could be your own personal code of morality or the one that the military instills in you. So let's say, for example, you truly believe you're like a door-kicking, badass motherfucking soldier and you're going to go out and spread some freedom, and then you go out to Iraq and you shoot a kid. That doesn't square with your deeply held moral views. And actually it happens a lot. That kind of stuff happens a lot. And that damages you. And in this country, it's just comes under the heading guilt. And in America, they've started to recognize that moral injury is an actual thing. But it's interesting that, as I understand it, the majority of veteran suicides hinge on guilt rather than post-traumatic stress. And so it's things you've done which kill you in the end. But here it's like our military medical establishment is so conservative and backwards. And that's true from World War I right through to today, that they resist any new kind of categorization, because they call it a signature injury, and the signature injury of the war on terror is moral injury, and they would look at it as something which people would use to kind of get out, to shirk, to get out of tours and stuff like that, whereas actually it's a very serious and deadly condition.
And how does it manifest? How did it manifest for you?
Profound guilt, deep anxiety, and sometimes it looks like PTSD, but it is a distinct condition, basically. But I mean, it's just not a thing in the British military medical kind of lexicon. It's just not something we discussed.
So then, what next? What happens that you've asked to be relieved of your duties going back to Afghanistan, both because of PTSD and moral objection. You've been declined. Refused.
Refused, yeah. Well, I refused on the basis of the morality. Had I not had PTSD, I would have been in a better position to present that case more coherently. But I was pretty broken at that point. So then I did what thousands of soldiers do every year for a variety of reasons, and went AWOL, went on the run for 2 years. I had a load of blood money from tour. Came back from Africa. I think we had like $8,000. It's the richest I've ever been.
Because I suppose because you don't spend any money away, do you? So
no, and that was the first year we didn't have to pay tax. Like previously, British soldiers had to pay tax on tour, so we then got a rebate. So we were like fucking loaded. So we just got back and like just caused loads of trouble. Everyone got into loads of trouble just drinking. Hadn't seen a woman or had a drink for 7 months. Just went fucking crazy. But that was before. Then when I got posted to the new unit, I still had a load of money left, and I just disappeared. I was like, where can I go? I should get points for like enterprise and inventive. I was like, where can I go where I can just disappear and there's like loads of drugs and booze, because I need to get fucked up, because I was a fucking mess. And so I ended up in Bangkok, as you do, and strangely Vietnam in the end. So I ended up on the run from Afghanistan in Vietnam and smoking opium on the fucking Mekong and shit. It was really like what's it called? It's Apocalypse Now.
It's exactly
it was like crazy. It was crazy. And then I eventually came out the other end of that tunnel. Ended up in Australia for a couple of years, because a load of people I'd met were traveling to Oz to do this like 2-year visa thing, and I was like, and they were all like middle class kids going out to work in Australia, and I was just this squaddy on the run with a big beard who's like fucked up, had PTSD, and so I turned up in Australia. But I remember applying. I was like, I'm just going to try this. If not, I'll go back, because I had a return ticket. I always planned to go back, and I applied online, and they were like, there were some questions on there. It was like, do you have any training with firearms or explosives? And have you ever been part of a terrorist organisation? And I was like, no, to both. And then 2 days later, it was like, we'll come to Australia. And they just gave me this visa to Australia. And then I was out there for like 18 months or so. And then that was running out. And I think when I was there, I kind of settled in a little bit, and I kind of maybe stopped drinking so much and started to recover and think about what I was going to do. And the views started to crystallise in something probably more political. And so eventually I came back voluntarily to the UK. After 2 years and 6 days, when I got back, in the guard room, like the gatehouse of the unit, I was like the most wanted. There was a list because there were so many people AWOL from my unit, and I was the Osama bin Laden.
And what made you the most wanted? What had you done that was so egregious?
I was away for 2 years and 6 days, and there was a captain on duty when I got back, and they were like, go and see the captain, and he was like, fucking good effort, Glenton. Good effort. And like almost gave me a slap on the back, and then he was like, and we're charging you with AWOL. And so, but then because I came back voluntarily, I wasn't a flight risk, so they were just like, you are now Lance Corporal Glenton again, and they just put me back in the unit. This dissenting, mutinous scumbag back in the unit, and so I kind of waited there, and then the legal stuff and the trial played out.
What's the punishment for going AWOL?
It really depends, like how long you're away, what your reasons are.
So for 2 years like and 3 months getting pissed in Australia, what's the punishment?
They upped it to desertion, which is a much more serious charge, which is AWOL with either the intention to remain away forever or the intention to avoid an operational tour. So I'd come back voluntarily, so they tried to get me on the second one, which is to avoid an operational tour.
Yeah.
But at that time, I'd come back a more political animal, and I started to campaign. So I had this weird double life where by day I was this squaddy in some barracks in Oxfordshire, and then at weekends I'll be coming and speaking at like Stop the War rallies and like sending my commanding officer insane. He would like ring me up and be like, Glenton, do not march on that thing, and I'll be like, I understand, and then I would go march and he would see me, and so yeah, that went on for a while, and then they kept adding charges, so they kept adding these extra charges which carried like sentences of years for disobeying orders, because speaking to the media is just illegal in the army unless you've got a script or a rifle pointed at your screen or whatever, in case you fuck up and say something bad. And so that went on for a while, my double life, and then they locked me up like on remand in Colchester Military Prison, known as the Glass House, to shut me up until I agreed to stop speaking.
But you didn't
Here
stop
you are
speaking,
today.
right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did for a while, because I was like, I think everyone kind of knows my position now, because I've been doing like I can't imagine what it was like for my people above me, because they'd think they'd told me off, and then they would see me on fucking Sky News, like slagging off the war in Afghanistan. So it must have crazed them. But yeah, that played out, and then they let me out, and I was just waiting for my trial. Which
This is a trial for desertion.
Well,
this is now a trial for speaking to the media.
For desertion and speaking to the media.
Orders.
Yeah. And so then they, so my brilliant lawyer, Nick Rack, created this document. I was like, my objections, he kind of helped give voice to my objections. And so we made this monstrous document, which is like an indictment of the war on terror. And they were like, we want your skeleton argument. Well, apparently it's normally like 2 pages of A4. And we sent this like massive tome to the military prosecuting authority, and then we just left it to stew for a couple of weeks. And then we rang them up, and they said, okay chaps, we're dropping all of those charges and the desertion, and it's just AWOL. And I'd never denied being AWOL. I mean, I can't really argue that, because I literally wasn't there. I was absent without leave. And so we went to it wasn't even a trial, it was just a sentencing, because I pled guilty to it and never denied it. And then they gave me 9 months in jail, of which I served like 5 months back in this military prison, which was like pretty cool actually. It's kind of cool.
In what way?
Just because the people I was with were all in like a state of rebellion, and no one gave a fuck, and we like terrorized all the screws. And we were planning like to do we pondered doing like strikes and stuff like that, but also it's like mutiny in the prisons is 10 years, and we were it's all short sentences in that military prison, so we were like, is it really worth it?
Yeah, if you're there for 9 months and you get 10 years for mutiny, it's
it's not really. But yeah, it was kind of interesting. And we had like people smuggled, it was just chaos. Like people smuggled drugs in, people just smoking weed in the yard, and the screws didn't know, because they were soldiers. They didn't even know what weed smelled like. So we'd just be sat there smoking fucking weed, and they'd come over and talk to us.
Soldiers don't know what weed smells like.
Yeah, well, apparently that's the only explanation I have, because the place would the yard would on the bleachers or whatever would stink of weed, and the guys would just be sat there smoking like as a roll up, but
yeah,
weed, and they would just be like, all right lads, how's it going, like in billowing smoke. We got like drugs raided. They got like a load of police sniffer dogs in and shit. We were all in the yard like in a Mexican prison. This is all in the book. Like this, and they had the dogs going around. It was fucking crazy, but it was kind of good fun as well. And I knew that they only had me for so long and I was out. So I knew that day was coming when I would leave the jail and the military, which was like July in 2010. That was me done, out.
I'm gonna see if I can make my laptop do the goods. Can I get something up on the screen? Great. So this is the chief. What's the head of the army called? Well, the head of the Britain's Armed Forces. That's what I'm going to go with.
CDS. Yeah.
So he's complaining that young cannot be relied on to back notion of service. So what this sounds a bit like to me, right? So the army have a problem with you. You're someone who is not willing to unquestioningly follow the orders of the British high brass if you don't agree with what's going on. If there are too many of you, this is an absolute disaster for the British military, for the British army. And it looks to me like they're worried that more and more people are either joining the army with a sense of this is conditional on whether I back what I'm being told to do, or just don't join in the first place because they don't believe in they don't believe that what the British army does is necessarily protecting our freedom, as the Royal Legion would like us to believe.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a real problem for the British army, which might be a good thing for the rest of the world, in that young people aren't willing to subject themselves to just follow orders unconditionally?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on here. You have to understand Nick does this basically every year and has done every year during his tenure as a very senior defence chief, slags off millennials. And I think it's very unfair to blame, considering millennials have just fought 2 wars and will fight several more, I suspect it's unfair to blame millennials for the failings of the British Army.
I get some of them are really generic criticisms of millennials that I want to get some of them up. So it's like we've got short attention spans. I wonder whether the coming generation who are less likely to have been exposed to military service, I mean, not many generations were exposed to military service.
If he's talking about the coming generation, that's not millennials, is it? That's
who obtain their... Well, millennials are coming of age... Oh, yeah, because as you say, people only join at 18.
I'm reassured I am a millennial, and I'm 82, which is like the cut-off, I think.
You need to learn the names of the cohorts, mate. So Nick Carter. You're talking about generation Y or Z?
Yeah,
but I mean, he's trying to lock into a particular narrative around millennials, right? And I think, like, for me, like, as you're talking now about this whole kind of recruitment crisis that the military are having and how that's interlocking with a lot of the stuff happening around education, right? So you have the prevent agenda, right, which one of their signs of someone being vulnerable to radicalization is questioning British foreign policy, is having a critical having a critical perspective on British foreign policy. And then you look at, I think it was in 2010 or something when Michael Gove, the first thing he did as education secretary was go for the history curriculum and go for how war is taught and how, the First World War in particular. And he talks about the kind of Blackadder portrayal of war as being, destructive and that, and same with, portrayals of empire that, we're inculcating like the younger generation with post-colonial guilt. And it fits really nicely into like not only the kind of stuff around millennials, but also the nostalgia narrative around Brexit, the political correctness gone mad sort of narrative. So it's happening at multiple levels, this kind of like attempt to, first of all, stop this tide of anti-war sentiment, and to also kind of stop this tide of like not tide of critical thinking, but diminish whatever strain of critical thinking has been permitted in the education system. And I think it's no coincidence that the history curriculum was the one that Michael Gove went for, because it's powerful. The soul of like how people understand nationhood is in history, and it's in that the hegemonic narrative of what history is,
So this is what both Michael Gove and I keep forgetting his name. Sir Nick, what's he called? You must know, he was your old boss.
Carter.
Sir Nick Carter.
Yeah.
He's saying that young people aren't patriotic anymore. They won't sort of like they don't hold their nation with higher regard than anyone else, and also they see the armed forces as victims. And so the armed forces are apparently, the high brass are really concerned if anyone sees the armed forces as victims, as opposed to heroes, because they
Yeah.
think if you just see them as victims, who wants to be a victim? Who's going to join?
Exactly.
Which is partly why Remembrance Day has to become so militaristic. It has to be a celebration of war, because if it's a somber commemoration of war, then who's going to want to join the fucking army?
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
So you have to celebrate war. It's sort of like the only logical possibility if you want to maintain British militarism is it has to be a kind of bittersweet, kind of happy event where you're celebrating heroism.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. Nick Carter is poorly positioned to convince the country that generals are not Blackadder style buffoons. I'll be honest about that. But also, I mean, the other side, he's saying that millennials don't understand the nature of military service. You could perfectly easily put the other argument that they're not joining. We have a recruiting crisis, precisely because they do understand what's involved. And I know the MOD has poured a lot of effort and commissioned papers looking at the hero versus victim narrative, the hero versus victim versus villain narrative of being a British soldier, by which a British serviceman more broadly. So they're very conscious of this. And part of these kind of statements, it always feels staged, because he does this every year. He disparages millennials every year. He like comes and slates them. And it just feels like there's some PR op behind it where he says that, and then the focus is on the nature of military service. It's just before Remembrance. It just feels staged to me.
It's like he's read a book on how to be a tough parent, and he's got to the chapter
Exactly,
of reverse
yeah.
psychology.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's like, you bloody millennials,
Yeah.
you wouldn't join the army, would you?
Yeah,
and
don't
then we're
clean
all
your
supposed
room.
to turn around and go like, I'll prove you wrong by joining
Yeah.
the army and killing people even when I don't believe in it, motherfucker.
Well, I will clean my room then, Mum.
And also, like, it's like he's almost read a textbook on how to kind of plug into the kind of emotional, like, the like emotional G spots of like, you know, Daily Mail, like Express readers, you know,
Yeah.
how to
Maybe
kind of
that's his
stir
target
up that
audience.
further. Yeah, of course.
I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, mate, that makes more sense to me, because he's not going to convince millennials to
Yeah,
join
they
by
don't give
going,
a shit.
you're all,
They don't give a shit, mate.
you're all a bit limp and stupid.
But I guess also that heroism thing I thought was really interesting is that like that kind of depicting it as, you know, as not as victims, you know, but as, you know, it's also a way of being like, you know, how many opportunities are there for young working class men to feel, you know, to feel good about themselves, or to feel, you know, celebrated, or, you know. So I guess like that's also preying on like on the kind of economic devastation of the working class in this country as well.
Yeah.
Like, well, you know, again, like you'll get women, you'll get, you know, glory, all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that really is
Yeah.
what they're playing on. And because the military often frames itself as a kind of replacement for the welfare state in some ways, but also as, and this doesn't stand up. There's plenty of evidence. If you go to Forces Watch, who I work for, and look at their website, they've done some really good stuff on the military's claim that it is a engine for social mobility. And none of it stands up.
Wow.
None of it stands up
Yeah.
in terms of on any metric. I mean, also particularly for young joiners, like, because we still have child soldiers, effectively, not in the sense they have in the Congo, but we still recruit 16-year-olds in. And when you look at how they score on all kinds of metrics like joblessness, mental health issues, drug abuse, drinking, when they come out, I don't think you can possibly make the argument that it's an engine for social mobility, or that it's a good thing, or that putting a military ethos into schools, which is there's a big effort to do that, and some of that's tied to the prevent programs, is a good idea or is valuable.
Yeah. Or
to
that
do
killing brown people should be like, you
Yeah,
know,
that's
the
fine.
option to
Yeah.
how you can make, you know, life for yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's no space for dissent in that. Yeah, it's very like top down.
I want to move on to another article you wrote, prolific guy. This was published only 4 days before the one about gammons. So this one, we can get this one up as well, I hope. The Tommy Robinson photo shows how far right the British Army is. There are good reasons why soldiers seem so excited to be seen with Britain's most notorious bigot. So this was obviously in reference to the story which happened, I think, at the beginning of last month, where Tommy Robinson found himself at a service station and had his picture taken with a bunch of members of the army, a bunch of British soldiers. The British soldiers were disciplined for having been singing the Tommy Robinson song on film, and that got made into sort of like a huge internet outrage where how dare the British Army be challenging freedom of speech to enforce political correctness within our armed forces. But I suppose I'd like you to explain sort of your argument here. Why were you not surprised to see these soldiers posing with and celebrating Tommy Robinson?
A range of reasons. I've come to think of the military as a far-right organisation. I don't mean the people in it. I met plenty of liberal-minded people. I was in the military and I'm on the left. But as an institution, the military is anchored to very demonstrably, identifiably right-wing ideas about submission and power and racialised violence and conquest.
Hierarchy.
Which are all a bit fash. I think we can just see that. And so it's probably understandable that people who are in that, and for other reasons, which maybe we can get into, might be drawn to the right. Also, you can look at these kids, and they're all, which you can't see if you don't know, because the military's so weird and tribal. They're all from northern regiments. They're all from regiments that recruit in the north. There's Mercians, Yorkshire Regiment, towns and cities which have been smashed for 30 years under neoliberalism, which can also create a fertile ground for people to start spinning off to the right. So there are complex reasons why the links between the military and the far right are there, which merit exploring. I'm not saying at all, which was straight away what I was being attacked with, that, and again, as any Guardian writer will tell you, that's not my headline. I didn't write that. I'm not saying that the military, everyone in it is a fascist or a nationalist. But I mean, even in my time, I saw plenty, particularly of like loyalists, Northern Irish loyalists, loads of people have those ideas, loads of people with EDL type ideas, less so like card-carrying neo-Nazis. There's a case playing out at the moment where a couple of guys were members of National Action, isn't it? A proscribed group. So there's a lot of crossover there. It's very complex. It crosses over in complex ways. But don't be surprised that the far right figures like Robinson could have some purchase over young, naive soldiers. And those guys were in training. They weren't qualified soldiers. They were kids. But yeah, I just think you have to take a nuanced view of it and look at why and what. And maybe it's a broader question for the left. Like at some point, if old Jezza wins, the left, the Labour Party, a left-wing Labour Party with a left-wing leadership, will inherit an imperial army which is profoundly, deeply attached to a violent colonial past. There's a question there about what you do with it and what you want it to look like and what you want it to do, and how, if at all, you can de-link it from those things, because there's a huge contradiction there.
I mean, that's the crux of it. Once you get into power, so if Jeremy Corbyn is the next Prime Minister, he can't be anti-army. I mean, he's not going to abolish the British Army.
I don't think he is anyway.
So what does one do in that position where, I mean, as you've said, you think the British Army is, in a way, a far-right organisation. Is it reformable? Does it become something that's not a far-right organisation, or how would that work? Yeah, well, this is a question which I think the left needs to consider when it talks about foreign policy and the army as a agent of foreign policy, as a tool of foreign policy. And what would it do? I don't know. But the army has been reformed many times in the past. There are other armies which are... Are they non-racist armies? Yeah, that's
I don't know, but there are armies which spend less time killing brown people and more time on humanitarian things. There are examples of that. There would be enormous resistance to that, because the military establishment is hugely proud that it has an army which has spent centuries killing brown people. It's very attached to that, and those things are celebrated in the army. Regiments celebrate their involvement in things like crushing the Indian Mutiny, and you'll see on their regimental colours. I was talking to Gary earlier. Regimental colour, it's like the flag of the regiment, which is prized, and you'll see battle honours on there, and some of them will be from the Peninsular War, some of them will be the Somme and Ypres, and when you go back you will see ones from the Raj, some from Egypt. You'll see my regiment had a Victoria Cross from Rorke's Drift, Zulu, and they're very proud of these. These things are toasted at mess dues. They're an integral part of military identity. I mean, and how do you what are you going to do with that?
The interesting comparison would be, because I suppose what we've been talking about all show in a way is how Britain is so committed to reinventing its past as something that's good, and there's a complete opposition, sort of like a deep opposition and sort of a very aggressive opposition to any kind of reckoning with Britain's past. So I suppose the comparison would be with the sociology of the German army or the Japanese army, where sort of like their national culture is really tied up in a disavowal of the militaristic past of those countries.
So I think in both those examples it has slipped a bit, because in Japan they what did they do? They kind of recalibrated their neutrality, didn't they, to become a more, so they could go and do things outside of Japan. And the Germans were in Afghanistan with us under a very limited remit, but they are involved in or shaping to be involved in imperial stuff.
Yeah, and I think the question of sort of Corbyn and, you know, what does an anti-imperialist, how does an anti-imperialist approach the Corbyn project? And I think it's important to obviously firstly recognise the limitations that Corbyn is looking to become the head of a neo-colonial state, right? So that has limitations within it. But my worry is that doesn't mean that as anti-imperialists we walk away from the project completely, because just as this is the case with like prison abolition or any kind of abolitionist movement, there are different kinds of reform, right? There are reforms that entrench the presence of the military and entrench or kind of preserve or liberalize or kind of whitewash, pinkwash, whatever, greenwash the military. So like kind of image rehabilitation. And then there are the reforms that are kind of more oriented towards abolition. So shrinking the resources, rolling back the role of Britain in other kinds of imperial formations like NATO. And also like, you know, Britain plays a huge role in the military industrial complex. And there's often this mistaken idea that arms exports is really important to the British economy. It's not important to the British economy. It's important to the military sector, which is a corporate sector. So there is like really significant leeway that Corbyn, and like there are tangible commitments that Corbyn can and really needs to make in areas like the military industrial complex and in Britain's role in larger neo-colonial formation. So just because but then at the same time recognizing that we also need to create extra parliamentary movements in order to tackle the fact that imperialism cannot be entirely rolled back by a nation state, right? So like I think there's definitely scope for Corbyn to do, and we have to lobby and pressure him to take those kinds of abolitionist reform moves, if that makes sense.
We're going to do what I was going to do at the start of the show, and then we're going to go to audience questions. So we're going to look at the best use of the poppy in Britain in 2018. Actually, I don't exactly know the provenance of these pictures, so they might be from previous years, but run with me. This is definitely from this year. So this is someone has made their front garden into a World War I trench.
I like the idea that this is just a guy who's like really quite pissed off with like dogs shitting in his lawn and stuff. Exactly. And he's just like, this isn't actually about Remembrance Day at all. This is just like a big fuck off sign on his front lawn.
Maybe I'm wrong, but in the First World War, was No Man's Land signposted?
I don't know. That's a really good question. Yeah. Where does he put his car? Is that the sacrifice he's made for?
Oh yes, respect.
The hashtag Fallens.
Many respects.
I will park on the street for you.
This is someone. I'm just going to go with Poppy Watch's joke with this. This patriot wore so many poppies his spine snapped under the sheer weight of the respect.
It's profoundly disturbing.
I
wouldn't be surprised, you know.
This is for anyone who was in any doubt that Remembrance Day is not about celebrating militarism. They literally shot a load of poppies out of a tank.
Tank fest.
Oh my God.
And I think they're dropping...
Jesus
It looks
Christ.
like they're dropping poppies from the planes as well.
All happens in Dorset.
Next one. My computer's disconnected again. We're back again. No, we're not.
Save us, Gary.
Yes.
Save us.
We are. Peaky Blinders, lest we forget. And this is my favourite one.
Oh my God.
For any snowflakes watching this that weren't already offended by the poppy, this is a poppy made of bacon. Someone has made a poppy out of bacon to own the libs.
Is that a garnish, or is that the original paper green thing? I wonder if they've...
Well, yeah, no, they've taken the paper poppy off the paper, the thing that you buy from Tesco, and they've added a bit of bacon. And staying with the meat theme, we have all our meat is British, lest we forget.
That's so sinister.
Gammon incarnate.
Like dead flesh, just embellished with.
Yeah, it's really gross.
Be the meat.
Be the meat you want to
see in the world. Great.
Uh,
I mean, I'm ready to sign up. I don't know about you guys. I'm convinced.
Yeah, let's do it. Sign back up. I might join something else like the RAF this time. Apparently it's easier.
it's a bit posh of the RAF, isn't it?
Oh,
Yeah.
I've got a fear of flying.
Plumb your accents.
Yeah. Maybe the Navy. Let's go for a cruise. Go for a jolly.
Yeah.
All right, some questions. Come on, in the comments. Oh, this is interesting.
Someone wants you to close your tabs, Michael.
Well, I've got my tabs open because there were so many glorious examples of uses of the poppy.
Critical tab.
Oh, this is a good one. What are your opinions on the white poppy? You know, I've got another relevant tab to this. So before I ask you, we are going to go to Johnny Mercer's view
Johnny.
on the white poppy.
Yeah.
We aren't because my tab doesn't work. I'm going to read it out anyway. Johnny Mercer, MP. White poppies are attention-seeking rubbish. Ignore the wearers of them. If you don't want to wear a poppy, don't bother. They fought and died so you could choose. But don't deliberately try and hijack its symbolism for your own ends. Joe Glenton, what do you think about Johnny Mercer's outburst there against the white poppy? Maybe first of all explain what the white poppy is.
So the white poppy is only like, I think it's about 10 years younger than the red poppy. So it's been around a long time. It's not like someone's just conjured it up. And it recalls, laments all of the dead in war. That's literally what it means. And it's been around for a very long time. Like some people, I don't get caught up in this debate personally, but like some people wear both, some people wear none, some people wear one or the other. But the white poppy, it just means something more broader than just the red poppy. And a part of it was, and it tells you how long this debate's been going on. Part of it was about a rejection of the militarist narrative, which very quickly started to grip the red poppy, surround the red poppy.
Yeah, I remember getting into a massive argument with one of my housemates when I was at uni about the white. I wasn't wearing a white poppy, but I think I mentioned something about it, and she was like, "It's disrespectful to politicize the poppy." And I think again that there's that idea of an apolitical national good that the poppy represents. And I was just like, look, the minute a warmonger puts that poppy on their it's political, it's politicized, and Adam Ramsey's piece in Open Democracy really brilliantly outlines how the poppy was political from day one, from day dot, but that idea of the apoliticalness of the poppy is just again this completely whitewashed historical narrative that is promoted.
I mean, that point that it wasn't co-opted is a really interesting one. So we can get up this section so it's Adam Ramsey's article in Open Democracy. Debates about poppies are nothing new, but the tone has changed in Brexit Britain. We're not focusing on the bit about how the tone has changed. We're focusing on his story of the origins of it. So he's saying the poppy was chosen by the wife of one of the top generals in the First World War. So this was a kind of an elite-driven thing. And
the butcher of the Somme.
Exactly.
His wife, yeah.
And the reason the poppy was chosen was because it was part of John McCrae's In Flanders Field, whose final verse is an explicit statement that refusing to continue to fight is an insult to those who have already died. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. So it's from its very inception, the point of Remembrance Day was to say, to disagree with the purpose of a war is to disrespect the people who died in it.
Sure, yeah.
Which is kind of like the function it still plays, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's also the Royal, that's the official line. So the Royal Legion, if you go on their website, what they say is we are celebrating British troops and people who fought with them, no one else, and we're celebrating them for defending our freedom. So and then on another page it's what wars are we remembering? So it's got Iraq, Afghanistan. So you are to frame Iraq and Afghanistan as defending our freedoms is hella politicized, if you ask me.
First World War. I mean, they're all contested to some extent.
Well, wasn't the phrase that soldiers in the First World War were lions led by donkeys?
Yeah.
That's pretty fucking political.
It is,
that's like soldiers disagreeing with the reason that they're being sent to war, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I had a good... Oh, this is a good one. Lawrence Reagan. Does military training encourage lack of empathy and antisocial tendencies?
Yes. Shall I unpack that?
Yeah, go on, unpack it a little bit.
There's all kinds of thought about this. I think it creates antisocial tendencies towards certain people. So the best explanation I've heard of it is that military training does a couple of things. It teaches you how to obey orders without question. It removes the barrier to kill. And there's another aspect to it, which I can't remember, but I'll come back to. But it's really about what you take out and what you put in and how you shape people. And so some of it is about that. But there's also the best way I've learned to explain how soldiers think after training is that there's kind of in terms of how their attitudes to other people, there's kind of a hierarchy of hate, if you like, of dislike. And the enemy is abstract. Like, you don't know, the enemy could be an Irishman, could be a Iraqi. You don't really know who that is. And so they're not really there. And normally fights take place over very long distances anyway. It's not like a personal thing. Below that, or above that, the people you hate more viscerally are other soldiers. You're taught, because the military is tribal, to hate soldiers from other units. And they all hate each other. And everyone hates, like the army hate the RAF, for example. And the Navy and the Army get together and hate the RAF. So everyone's played off against each other culturally. But even further up that hierarchy of hate, this is why it always amazes me when you see loads of all the civilians on Remembrance going, oh, look at our boys. Like, soldiers fucking despise civilians.
Yeah.
Like, hate civilians.
That, yeah.
Absolutely. They are the worst for all these reasons that they conjure up, because they're weak, because they're not in the military, because they're like seen as effeminate somehow. Like, most of all, and sometimes still, I admit, it's so deep that civilians piss me off.
So
even now.
Yeah, like, how does it feel? Like, one thing I wanted to ask from, like, at the beginning of the show was Remembrance Day, from the perspective, like, when you're in the military and watching civilians kind of doing, who don't give a shit about, fighting against, like, the wars that you're being sent to, and, like, the reason that you're there. Like, what is the relationship between sort of being on the inside and watching civilians engaging in this on the outside? Like, is it frustration or
I don't know.
how is it?
I actually find veterans are often more even-handed about the wars and more realistic off the record, like in a chat in the pub, about the wars and their reality. They may not be political, but they go, yeah, Iraq was bullshit, Northern Ireland was bullshit. So all this, a lot of the really venomous stuff, trolling and whatnot, comes from civilians rather than veterans, who really take it up and think they're like defending the honour of the troops and stuff like that. But certainly there is, but not in a political way, but certainly there's a lot of like deep-seated antagonism and contempt for civilians because they are just a bit fucking flaky, aren't they? Like, it's just a thing, which is really contrasts with the idea of service and serving the nation and all this stuff. It just doesn't. The reality is very different, and that's the military train that into you. Like, from day one, the military are slagged off. The civilians are slated. Like, goddamn civilians.
What's the function of that?
I don't know. I guess
Instill a sense of pride.
It's them and us. It's this they're trying to instill this tribal thing. So it's like the enemy is somewhere, but you really hate other soldiers and sailors and people from other units. But then civilians are treated, or thought of with absolute contempt behind closed doors.
Well, there's no other job where it's more necessary to instill such a strong identity among the people doing it, right? Because you have to be obedient, you have to do very difficult things, and you have to have, in many ways, what's kind of a shit life. You don't get to see your family very often, so you have to feel like what you're doing is a vocation to, the nth degree. And a lot
like the guys don't go in with that ideological stuff. It's when they come out, and that is in fact the other strand. So it's removal of the barrier to kill, obedience to orders without question, and instilling a gang mentality. Do not doubt that the military is a gang, and if you looked at analyses of gangs, many military units, particularly elite units, see themselves as precisely that. You're in the gang, you're in the tribe, you are loyal to it without fail, and all the processes like the hazing and stuff are part of that to instill loyalty.
Was there hazing?
Definitely, yeah. My unit less so. Actually, I think I just had a good, decent bunch of non-commissioned officers who didn't really want that. But in many units, they're like really, like, profound, dark hazing. A lot of it, like in the Marines, particularly, has a profoundly sexual undertone, like spanking each other.
That's why I asked, to be honest.
And doing strange. The Marines are famous for it. The Marines are really famous for it, and the parachute regiment, things like that. There's lots of like borderline sexual abuse type.
Well, because it comes from public school, doesn't it? So it would be the more elite.
Well, no, these are just the guys. These are not public school, but these are just But part of the culture of the regiment is this. Like, I know of guys who were made to like dance naked to get a weekend pass to go out in front of a seedy old corporal. and stuff like that.
Makes me feel sick.
And loads of weird.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically sexual abuse.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's across the board, but there is always a hazing process,
Yeah.
some of which has that kind of undertone. And I saw stuff like that. I've been made to. I imagine the rugby team times 20. It's like drinking each other's piss and stuff. You know, that is standard fare, really.
Wow.
Oskim 0. Did you meet any mercenaries in Afghanistan, and do you think they should be banned?
Well, we saw them in Afghanistan. I know people who are private military contractors or mercenaries, as I would call them. They should rightly be called. It should be regulated, and it isn't. Most of the private military industry is self-regulating, which is ridiculous, a ridiculous state of affairs. And what we've seen is that as there's less money in theatre, they've actually got. So originally it was like ex-special forces guys would get like £500 a day to be in Iraq, protecting oil companies or whatever, and then they started to bring in like cheaper people, and there's like a change in their colour as the wages are forced down. So then they went the Gurkhas, then they went the Fijians, and the last I heard they were using ex-Sierra Leonean child soldiers. A former British general had gathered these guys up who had been involved in demilitarising Sierra Leonean child soldiers and was gathering them up and sending them to Iraq to defend convoys and stuff like that.
So there's like a racial division of labour.
Oh, definitely, absolutely.
Right.
No doubt about that.
Yeah.
And this guy was he's a brigadier in the Household Cavalry, and he's like a kind of Victorian throwback, but he was also an aide-de-camp to the Queen at one point, and he left the military and became a private military guy. Sorry. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a racial division of labour there. But should it be banned? Probably. It should be more regulated. But how do you go about doing that? Is this question, I guess.
What jurisdiction are they under?
Well, this was
often none.
Yeah,
which was the problem, right?
That changed. It changed. Like initially in Iraq, it was like the Wild West early on, because obviously they went and destroyed civil society, disbanded the army, and people like soldiers were just killing random civilians and stuff like that. And then they brought in. Then there was a killing of a guy who I know's brother killed a couple of other contractors and an Iraqi, and then the Iraqi government made the case much more strongly to have it regulated, to ban private military contractors or make them prosecutable to a high degree.
Right. 3 more questions. Jody, 1987. I have friends who are young veterans, 30-ish. I can see they've got mental health problems. How do I, as a civvy, help them?
Mental health stuff for veterans probably has improved a little bit. There are I have a lot of issues with a lot of the charities, but there are charities which should be able to give you some kind of support. Obviously, that should be a function of the NHS. But yeah, you can signpost them to, I guess, things like combat stress and whatever provisions the NHS has through their GPs. I think there's more effort to recognise and deal with specific veterans' problems now. It has got a bit better.
Daniel Eden, would it be possible to democratise the UK army along the lines of the revolutionary groups in the Spanish Civil War?
Yeah, I think I like that idea, and I think a much more interesting case is the Levellers and the Putney debates and all that kind of stuff. The New Model Army had this kind of democratic core, which was crushed by force. But I think there's some really interesting ideas in there. And we talk about the far right and the army. There's as interesting history of the left and the army and dissent and outbreaks of democracy in the army, which is really interesting. And I say, unionise a fucking lot.
They say that there's more space for dissent in the army than the police.
I think so, yeah. And they have a different function. Because I always think squaddies, when they go back to their hometown, they go to the pub and people slap them on the back. And I don't think that happens with coppers. You know, you're separate from society in a different way than if you're a soldier.
There was a question related to that, actually, which was, are the army more likely to turn against an unjust leader than the cops?
Yes, I would say so.
Dalia, any thoughts?
I have no experience in either the army or the police force, so I have no idea.
Situations against an unjust ruler.
Egypt's a really good example where there was a point where I think the regime thought the army's going to go one way, so we have to get rid of I forget, not Morsi, the guy before him.
Mubarak.
Yeah, like it's either he goes or they go, because obviously it's a conscript army. So
the relationship between military and civilian life is really strange.
They own industries.
But the police are definitely in Egypt more unpopular with the people.
Yeah.
Final question. Punkadelic 2. What are the best war movies? Punkadelic's favourite war movie is Full Metal Jacket.
That's a good movie. I think the best war movie, the most haunting war movie I've ever seen is Thin Red Line, which is fantastic. Fantastic. Everyone is in this film. Has a brilliant Hans Zimmer score, and it's just fucking incredible film. And the main guy is a deserter who ends up going back to his unit. It's like in the Pacific Islands in World War II, and it's fucking like everyone, like Sean Penn has like a walk-on part, and then George Clooney's on for it, and it's like this brilliant cast, and it's just a beautiful film in these Pacific Islands. It's fucking stunning. I love it. Yeah.
Dalia?
My favourite war film.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a war film, but I think Battle of Algiers
God, yes.
an amazing. There's a really brilliant scene there, where kind of the French, there's sort of like words gotten back to the French that, you know, about like human rights abuses or like whatever in Algeria, like, hello, of course there fucking was. And then there's a kind of press conference where they start asking like one of the top military generals, and he does this incredible speech about like, you guys believe that we have a right to Algeria. If you believe this, like this kind of like torture and, you know, militarization of the streets and stuff, that's a necessary part. So if you are for us occupying Algeria, which was consensus in France at the time, then don't question our methods, because we know what we need to do in order to keep Algerians in check. And so I think like that, if you look like colonial warfare and like the impact of it on like the city and how it's shaped and the body and all of that, Battle of Algiers is incredible.
It's also amazing just sort of like as a study of anti-colonial tactics.
Yeah.
So you learn about the whole structure of how the movement worked, where someone only ever knows two
other
people above them in the
Yeah.
hierarchy, so that you can't take out the top person, and that suddenly outs everyone who's part of the revolutionary struggle.
Yeah.
It also was filmed, I think, a couple of years after the end of the Revolutionary War, and the main characters were played by the revolutionary leaders.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Really, really.
Directed
One of
by
my
an
favourite
Italian.
books is about that period, which is called Legionnaire, which is about an Englishman called Simon Murray, who founded the Orange mobile phone company, who was caught up in the Algerian War, was a posh kid who ended up in the French Foreign Legion. And it's an amazing book, but it's the brutality.
The French.
Scorched earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were something else.
So I was just looking at some of the film suggestions. I'm not sure if Watership Down was a war movie.
Bright Eyes.
Star Wars Clone Wars, that's definitely a war movie. And
it's a War in the Stars.
Yeah.
Starship Troopers.
People miss this, but John Boyega's character is a deserter.
Yeah.
And Han Solo is a deserter. Like, they miss that desertion is cool, and the good guys desert. But then we don't think of ourselves as the Empire, do we?
Yeah.
And we need to.
The Star Wars films, but all of the like Empire guys in the most recent film were all white dudes, and all of the like rebellion were all people of color and women, which I was like, the alt-right got very upset about that.
Watership Down is a World War
Wars
One
films have been like
analogy, says Gary McQuiggan. Sorry, I ever doubted it. I'm not even sure I've seen the movie. I was confusing it with Animals of Farthing Wood, but I think that might be a different kettle of fish.
Yeah, it's very violent.
Should wrap up, I reckon. So thank you both for joining me.
You're welcome.
You never, because of the technical problems, you never heard the pitch that I always give you about 3 times a show. You're only going to get it once tonight, which is we want to grow and expand as an organisation. If you are watching this, make sure you are subscribed to Novara Media YouTube. Please like the video so more people see it. Share the video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Novara Media as part of our sub-raiser. As you know, we are requesting the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can continue working around the clock, getting bigger and better. At some point in the future, potentially starting on time, but I do like to see your chats while we're waiting. Anyway.
We need to buy another Gary. We need to automate Gary.
Gary's,
We need money to automate
No, we're not
him.
going to try and automate Gary, actually. I think we're keeping him.
We need
Just
to get him a
He's
house.
not going anywhere.
Pay him.
Send him your best wishes, because he's in for the long haul now. I got lost track. This was Tisky Sour. We are Novara Media. I'll see you next Monday.